So, guys. So, thank you very much for being part of the Boost Analyst program. And today, I want to do things a little bit different. I want to start off by looking into a problem, which is a global problem. But just over the last week, I've been working with an executive from Saudi Arabia who's actively involved in the sustainability space. And he brought to my attention how bad steel is for the environment. So I want to use that as a case study and see how far we can, how quickly rather, not how far, how quickly we can understand a concept and then kind of build around it some kind of, problem solving initiatives and so on and so forth, right? So let's see how it goes. So why? Okay, first, sorry, act. And you guys know this, right? ChatGPT has advanced beyond this, but at the same time is a good place to start. So act like an expert management consultant, right? You don't need to do this anymore, but I just like doing it, just part of my prompting setup. And I've said this time and time again, right, guys, that EQ of AI is going to be a game changer for the people. Like IQ is something that technology does better than human beings now, but the EQ of using AI is going to be a big deal. So I still feel that informing ChatGPT of your expectations, i.e., act like an expert management consultant, structuring your prompts is very important. So what can you tell me about the steel industry in terms of its impact on the environment, right? And this is super, super cool because when he was telling me about this, I was like genuinely blown away. I thought, wow, this is actually really, really cool stuff, right? So steel is one of the most carbon intensive materials in the world. And when he told me that, I was like, nah, are you serious? But then I was thinking about it and I was like, damn, it must be, right? It absolutely must be. You're having to mine this stuff. You're having to transport it. You're having to then, after you mine it, you have to then, I don't know, heat it up or something. You have to do something to it. You have to burn huge amounts of energy to then manipulate it into whatever you need it to do. Then it's really heavy. Then you're going to transport it and yada, yada, yada. So it's mental, right? So we're talking about 1.9 to 2 billion tons per year is the global production for steel. And it accounts for about 10% of global anthropogenic CO2, whatever that bloody well means, right? And 75% of steel today is produced via coal-based blast furnaces. Now, this executive that I was with, he said to me, Fahad, if you ever, go to a factory or rather a steel manufacturer, right, you can see it from miles away because they are burning these furnaces and it's just like smog everywhere. It's horrible, right? And again, I'm not an expert in this stuff, but the idea is that the skills, if you learn as a consultant, you apply it to anything, it still makes sense, right? So basically what we're saying is there's the CO2 emissions a lot, there's energy use, there's water use, there's air pollution, there's waste byproducts, there's land mining impact. It's actually horrible. And one thing he told me, right? One thing he told me was he actually said, is it worse than the impact of petrochemicals? Like when people think kind of impact of environmental impact on stuff, what do they think? They tend to think of, cars, right? So let's see if we can figure out if it is actually worse than cars or not. Excellent question. All right, so let's have a look. Sorry, I'm still not really 100%. I don't know why. It's been over a week and I've still got a runny nose and my throat is still a bit playing up. But anyway, so steel industry, petrochemicals. Okay. Energy intensity, comparable. Okay, who's worse? Steel, comparable. Petrochemicals. Similar, petrochemicals. Solid waste, air pollution, petrochemicals. So I'll just make it bigger for you guys. So consultant summary, steel is a primarily emissions problem. Whereas petrochemicals is a systemic environmental problem spanning emissions, toxicity, and pollution. So if you remove the pollution element, steel is dirtier today, but oh my God. So you see what I'm saying? When he was telling me this, though, I was genuinely shocked. I was like, dang it, I didn't realize steel was so bad. Did anyone know that? Or is it just me that was a complete, like, oblivious to this? Steel is mad. Steel is mad. And I guess the discussion that he and I were having, and the kind of discussion that I went down, is that there are genuine. Okay, so steel is pretty bad, right? Right, steel is pretty bad. So what are the alternatives, right? And this is the whole discussion started around this, and it was a very, very interesting discussion, right? So it's electric furnace, of course, hydrogen, DRR, direct reduced iron. Okay, whatever. I don't know what any of this stuff is. And this is the discussion that we had, that actually petrochemicals could be used to offset the need for steel. And he gave me this example of a glass fiber reinforced polymer rebar, right? Which is basically a direct replacement for what's it called, for steel rebar. So steel rebars is like, you know when you see the shell of a building, the rebar is what kind of puts it, is the initial shell. So it's a major component of capex, right? So we have here rebar structural reinforcements, lightweight corrosion, supposedly. And then he helped me clarify this as well. He was saying, actually, well, the cost on a like-for-like basis is the same, but you tend to use a lot less GFRP than steel. So this idea, if you compare on a weight basis, yes, it is more expensive, but you end up using a lot less. So in fact, this is where, again, let's be careful with ChatGPT, right? So here's your assumption for GFRP, correct? Are you comparing weight? Are you comparing a weight? Should you be comparing linear? I think it was length. Because in fact, even you would use less GFRP. Let's see what it comes back with. Very interesting stuff, man. I don't know. I proper nerded out this week with this particular executive, and alhamdulillah, it was genuinely very, very interesting, very insightful stuff. Let's have a look what it's coming back with. I love the way, you see, when I talk about the EQ of AI, there are some, you know, ChatGPT now, it kind of shows you its kind of thinking process, and I promise you that thinking process is the EQ part of AI that we need to learn. Is how does it think? It's very, very important. Okay, so define the governing limit. So Sake, bro, you just jump in, bro, anytime.
Are you able to move the screen bit on the left?
Oh shit, my bad. Your instinct is right. The fair comparison is per linear meter of design equivalent, not just by weight. So expect more of a larger GFPRPs to be meet serviceability. Yeah, so exactly, I was correct. So it's not that it's just more expensive. It's you can't compare the two because they are fundamentally different. And so in essence, what we're saying is that petrochemicals and hydrocarbons are actually not as bad as, especially in certain use cases, right? It's not as bad as, say, steel, where people just assume steel is great when it's really not, right? So, you know, like, generally speaking, I think a lot of the time what we tend to do is look at a product level. This thing is made of steel, it doesn't emit anything, and you know, it's natural, right, in theory, but we don't think about the process before it, of mining it, of refining it, and then kind of, you know, transporting it to wherever it needs to be. Whereas, you know, in many instances, we kind of then overlook at the kind of the whole impact. But anyway, I just wanted to take this as an example, and I wanted to kind of run it for the next few sessions, just because it's so genuinely interesting, and it obviously touches on a massive pain point, which is sustainability. But as an agenda, right? Sustainability as an agenda only makes sense when it makes economic sense. And that's one of those things here, right? Is that this thing has to make sense from an economic sense in order for it to actually, you know, for people to then decide that, yes, they're going to go ahead with this. Sorry, guys, got a lot of slides here, but I've got this for you. But anyway, I just wanted to introduce that concept here because I think it's a very, very interesting concept. And genuinely, I was nerding out big time on the weekend, right? So I just want to start a new folder, which is a steel, and then we can start this properly. So again, the idea is that, look, this is for me at least, this is a really interesting case, but at the same time, I want to make sure that, you know, we look at it from the consulting lens so that we can actually take advantage of learning something new, but in the same context of the skills, because I'm telling you, man, these skills genuinely will allow you to break and solve problems. So anyway, let me just close this bad boy and then we'll get started straight away. So yeah, so inshallah, this is something that we'll be discussing over the next couple of weeks.
Okay,
So
yeah, sorry to interrupt you.
Tell me, bro, what's up?
Before you get in the case study, so what's interesting to me is to know how you dealt with that situation when you first assigned to a topic that you never, or you have no information about. So how was your reaction to that? So how you dealt with that senior management and that situation?
Wallahi, bro, you know, that's a very good question, because like I said, I kept on forgetting how to even say this, right? Like, it's genuinely, I think the world in which we work in now, and I think as a consultant, you're kind of expected to know more than the person in front of you. I can't pretend to be an expert on something I don't know anything about. So you see, and okay, I'm going to go off on a little bit of a tangent here. So this was the client, right? And he is an expert in this stuff, right? MashaAllah, he's an expert, right? And in many instances, bro, the relationship with clients is thought, like, people think that the relationships with a client, with a consultant, is that the consultant has to be the expert and we talk down to our clients, right? And sometimes some experts think that, well, no, the consultant is an idiot and we need to teach the consultant. So there is a kind of, you know, there isn't either he's like the clients teach us as a student, or they treat us as the expert. But I genuinely try to find that middle basis, which is, listen, man, if I don't know this stuff, I don't know this stuff, right? So I try to be like an equal to my client. I don't try to be like more intelligent, and I don't try to be like a student. I try to have encouraging and engaging conversations, and accordingly, alhamdulillah, it's a great way of just building relationship and rapport with your client. And that's teaching and expecting, you know, like, a lot of the time people say what do people say about consultants? They say, oh, you guys came in and just literally told me what I already know. That's not really the job of a consultant. I think has evolved, where maybe 50 years ago, this was where we stood, which is like, we are the experts. We will teach you how to fix your business. But I think as the role has evolved, a lot of consulting has now become, we are your partners, and that partnership is, you know, you have your expertise, we have ours, and we're kind of working together to get to the best possible solution. And so I was cool with being taught about GF PR. Like, I was enjoying it. I was like, wow, this is cool. But the skills that, you know, I have as a consultant allowed me to add value, to challenge, to push back, start making him think about different things, if that made sense. So that's how I dealt with it, bro. And I've done it before millions of times. You know, if I'm meeting with the CEO of a national utility company in Uganda, for example, there's no way I'm going to know more about national utilities than him, right? It's impossible. Like, so this idea that consultants are going to be, you know, going to find some real crazy insights and then somehow unlock some value that you've never thought of is unlikely. You know what I'm saying, bro? So that's how I personally dealt with it. And Yeah, I don't know if that even made sense or not, but yeah. What do you think, bro?
Yeah, definitely it makes sense. So, what's always strikes to my mind is how we are going to sit with that management if he gonna just throw to us a new problem that we never heard about. So how we are going to walk the talk with him? What kind of question we supposed to
Yeah,
ask him about? So in order
yeah.
to get a more information, just to avoid being a student and getting an information from him.
So I mean, look, it's not easy, huh? It's not easy, and but again, the role of a consultant is more like I always say the role of a consultant is more like decision making support. So we help make decisions, and our job is to help making decisions for like a CEO. And remember, the CEO has to answer to people as well, whether it's the board of directors, whether it's to investors. You know what I'm saying? Whether it's to a regulator. So the idea is that as a CEO, you bring in a consultant, right, to help you make a decision, right? And as part of helping them make the decision, the role of the CEO is not to just sit there and say, "Yalla, you tell me. I don't know. I'm stupid," because that's fundamentally not what CEOs are. There is no CEO that's stupid, right? There's not. There may be complexities that he's not dealing or she's not dealing with effectively, but you cannot be a CEO, a chief executive officer who's been appointed by ministerial decision or by some kind of voting process or some kind of super detailed selection and governance process, right? You can't be an idiot. So the idea that somehow, you're going to be there to teach him or her some new things is probably not correct, but you can still help them make very big and important decisions. And it takes us to a different question, but at the same time, what is a big decision? Right now, for me, a big decision in my world, right, is three things. It's something which affects lots of people, right? So that's one type of big decision. It's something which costs a lot of money, right? If something costs a lot of money, it's usually a case where it becomes a big decision. And if the impact of that decision is very long term, it could affect us in the 5, 10, 15, 20 years into the future. These are all big decisions, right? And as part of creating the right answer to these big decisions, it inherently can become very, very difficult. And that's where you bring in your consultant. Does that make sense, bro? So if you're not working with your consultant as a partner, there is a such thing, which is being a good client. Forget about being a good consultant. If your client is a douchebag, unfortunately, you're not going to get any value out of your consultant. If you treat your consultant like he is there to just be like a parrot and repeat everything you're saying, then I promise you that's what consultants will do, because at the end of the day they need to get paid, and they don't get paid by causing a conflict and by challenging the CEO. It's a function of working together as partners, right? So in many instances, at least my approach is, listen, man, I'm not an expert in glass fiber, polymer reinforcement, rebar. I can't even say it properly, right? But at the same time, I understand the economic rationale that this solution needs to meet in order for it to get a decision made from your regulatory authority, from your BOD, from your investors, and so on and so forth. Does that make sense, bro? Like, this is contextually, that's how
Yeah,
I do.
definitely. Yeah, it is. Yeah, thank you.
Alhamdulillah. Sorry, guys, I'm still very, I don't know, man. I feel, anyway, inshallah, let's see how it goes. So, Bismillah, let's go. And this is, sorry, guys, this is just the intro of today, huh? But this is something I genuinely found very, very exciting. And as you can imagine, right, this whole glass fiber polymer reinforcement rebar, this is all from petrochemicals, right? Glass, fiberglass, carbon fiber, all of these things are effectively very, very strong plastics. And plastics is made from oil and gas, right? So ultimately, if you have a bunch of oil and gas, like said country, you can potentially lead the way in creating an industry which is a complete alternative to steel, which is massive, right? It's huge. So, when we talk about, and this is a big misconception about Saudi Arabia. A lot of people think Vision 2030 is about making Saudi Arabia like the West. It is absolutely not, right? That's probably 1 to 10% max, right? This is about making the Saudi economy much, much stronger. And there are things like this which you wouldn't know because you read the BBC, and the BBC will say, oh, Saudi Arabia is doing boxing events and they've got a couple of concerts. Man, that's literally like 1 to 5%, if that. This is the type of stuff, like people don't know that the mining industry in Saudi Arabia is going to be the third pillar of the economy of Saudi, well before tourism, right? So again, there's some really, really interesting things there. And genuinely, I found that this subject got me really, really excited about, wow, this stuff is genuinely super cool. And how is Saudi Arabia going to position itself as the kind of leader in this stuff? I thought it was excellent. It was like a really interesting, engaging conversation. But anyway, let's go into this. So, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, guys. Now, I completely went off on one before even the introduction started, but I genuinely felt it was a very, very interesting debate. Now, what are we going to be discussing today? So I want to talk about sustainability for sure. Oops, sorry, what happened here? Oh, there we go. That's why. I want to talk about sustainability for sure. But again, the idea is that even if you don't know anything about sustainability, you learn these common skills, like from a business 101 perspective, using that consulting skill set. You can apply it to sustainability. You can apply it to tourism. You can apply it to, I don't know, space. Space seems to be the new frontier, right? For governments, etc., to spend billions of dollars on. It doesn't matter. But the idea is, if you understand business from a structured perspective, then inshallah, you should be in a position to really enjoy, like getting involved in things that are unknown to you. And I think that's one of the main things. In many instances, when you're dealing with people, they'll completely dismiss a particular section or a particular new knowledge area because they're like, listen, I don't know anything about it, I can't be helpful. That's nonsense. If you understand the context behind it, you're good to go. And that's inshallah what we're going to try and do. So I'm by no means a sustainability expert, but I am an expert in the decision-making process. So let's keep it moving. So first and foremost, guys, let's learning objectives. So inshallah, over the next 4 weeks, what are we going to be learning? We are going to be learning, number one, business context, which is exactly what we're covering today. So understanding, in essence, what is business, the decision-making process, and all these kind of critical things, right? So that's going to be number one. After which we will talk about problem solving. How are we going to solve problems? Well, in order to solve problems, the key thing will be to distinguish between a symptom and a root cause. And that's very, very important. So the symptom, in many instances, like for example, if we take the dentist example, is the pain. So in many instances, people are trying to fix the pain when in fact the real root cause of the pain is actually that you have a cavity, right? So the idea is that when you're doing structured problem solving, we're looking for cavities, and we're looking at, if we resolve the cavity, will it have an impact on the pain itself? So again, structured problem solving is the root cause and the kind of essence of what we're talking about. And then naturally, what we hopefully should be speaking of is some financial modeling, right? And because irrespective, and this is a great example, right? I said this earlier, sustainability is a cause which is dear to governments, dear to corporates, dear to small, medium enterprises, and also very dear to the people, because ultimately it's it impacts everyone's life in fact, I would go beyond everyone's life. It impacts every life being on planet Earth, both now, 10 years into the future, 100 years into the future, 1,000 years into the future, right? So being dismissive of sustainability is probably not a good place to be. It might be good for, political gesturing, which is what I find is happening right now. It's kind of seen as either you are pro sustainability or you're not pro sustainability, whatever. I don't care which side of that you sit on. But the reality is it will have an impact, right? And there are things that can be done in a better way, but ultimately they will not be done in a better way unless it makes dollars and cents, right? So people come up with lots of great ideas and opportunities around around kind of sustainability, but until they make sense, they will not take off, right? Unfortunately, that's just part of the decision-making process. And henceforth, understanding the numbers is extremely, extremely important. And of course, finally, the communication part, the presentation part, right? A lot of people think that I just do presentations for a living. Unfortunately, they are incorrect. It is a big part of what I do, but it's not the presentation, it's the communication of my insights, of my opinion. And believe it or not, people pay me for my opinion. That's crazy, but that's what it is, right? And if I cannot communicate that opinion effectively and accordingly, doesn't matter how good the understanding is, doesn't matter how what kind of problem I've identified, doesn't matter how good my economic analysis is, if I cannot communicate that, I'm screwed. And naturally, right, in light of just trends globally, right, we cannot ignore AI, right? And like you saw today, I don't know anything about GFPR, but I Googled, I chat GPT'd it. Now I kind of have a good understanding of what it is and, you know, what the implications of that would be. So the 5 key skills, guys, please, man, just remember this stuff, irrespective of how far and on. But this bad boy right here, I promise you, is the future, and not AI to replace us. No, right? We're not trying to replace ourselves. We're not trying to help AI. What we are trying to do is use AI, right? That's the critical thing here. We need to be able to use AI, because if we're not using it effectively, we are ultimately, what are we doing? We are replacing ourselves, right? And I promise you, where I think, just to go even deeper on that, where I think the real value is there, it's the EQ of AI. That for me is the future. And that doesn't mean good news for junior people, but ultimately AI will be doing a lot of the junior work. So I think like, if you look at, this is an interesting one, right? I think historically careers, you know, like people like me, this is your career would be like a 20-year journey, right? But I think if we take into consideration, so this is your traditional old man, right? If you're born in the 80s or early 90s, then your career would look like a 20-year career. But if you were born in like the 2000s and you were like some young ass dude, right? I think your career trajectory in light of AI, and I'm going to make a video about this because this is actually super interesting, right? Your career will look much kind of quicker, if that's right. So your foundations, your expertise, and then of course your ability to jump into leadership, rather than a 20-year process. I think this process, if you're kind of recently graduating, could be a 5-year process. What do you guys think? That's an interesting thing, no? What do you guys think? Because of, and this is largely to do with AI. So you have to learn faster. You have to position yourself as more competitive. And I genuinely believe a big part of that will be the EQ of AI. Any thoughts on that, guys? That makes sense, no?
Quick question.
Go for it, bro. So
when we look at point in time, are we assuming that for 2 different sets of people, it's at the same point in time?
So let's. It's okay. So I'm almost in. You know, I'm close to 20 years of experience. That's me, and I had to go through this foundations expertise. You know, say 5 years, 5 years here, 5 years here, and then 5 years here. Right. I'm just saying that not at the same point in time, because I started my career in the early 2000s, right? Whereas someone who's starting his career or her career in the 2025s, it could be 1 year here, 1 year here, and 4 years here. Does that make sense? That's what I'm trying to say. So it's not at the same point in time. It's just that who you are and when you were born, effectively, right? So Gen Z effectively would be here. I don't even know what Gen I am. And what Gen are we, bro? What's one? I don't know, right? Are we millennials? No, we're not. I don't know. I think
we are.
Are we millennials? Damn. So, right. So millennials will be around here, which is like 20 years. And then, you know, you've been there, done that. You got gray hairs or whatever. But Gen Z, I think in light of AI, your career trajectory will fundamentally look very, very different. And as part of looking very different, it's probably going to be like, damn, you just got to step up big time. And that's what AI is going to do. Like, that's, for me, is what AI is going to do. So the more time you spend learning this stuff, And of course, this stuff, I think a lot of that stuff is going to be replaced by AI. Again, it's just my hypothesis, man. Like, I could be completely wrong. I'm probably not. I'm probably 100% right, which is usually the case. But I'm just saying that AI eats this first part of your career up. So then the idea is that, well, okay, I need to get into this and this as quickly as possible. Have I gone off on one? Maybe I have, but
No, that makes sense.
yeah, it makes sense. Obviously, it makes sense because I said it. Right? I'm just kidding. Taib. So now that I've gone through all my conspiracy theories and all my, Gen Z is screwed stuff, like that's a big part of what I do, right? Gen Z is screwed all the time, right? As far as I'm concerned, Gen Z is screwed. Sorry, Gen Z. But let's go into this now, because this, I promise you, man, and alhamdulillah, over the last, I don't know, I think we've been doing this consistently now for 5 years, but I feel like since I've gotten onto TikTok and I've had to do this live in front of a much bigger audience than I've done historically, I've gotten better at it. Genuinely, I feel I've gotten better at it. And the process of me then solving and breaking down problems has also become much more refined. So hopefully, inshallah, you will see that and you will feel that as well. So I want to start off with a very basic question. What is business, right? And I want to ignore the public sector for the time being, but I want everyone to understand that, organizations and business is genuinely quite simple. It's just a set of processes built upon each other, and lots of different processes, which fundamentally create ultimately value. The end of the process equals value, but it is very simply an input. Let's say input multiplied by some level of configuration, which then gives you some level of output, and that output has to create value. That for me is like the simplest definition of business, and I think it's also a really good representation, because in the input, it's just process on top of process on top of process, right? And that goes here. Then there's some level of configuration, which is my Rubik's Cube analogy, right? Which I use every time, right? And then based upon that, you're left with some kind of product or service. And then you go to market with that product or service, and you exchange that product or service for some kind of money. And that money should have the ability to cover the cost of this, the cost of this. Also, there needs to be some level of delta or margin within that process, right? So if there is some level of margin, hopefully what that should do is leave some for investors, but also allow you to reinvest, right? So there's then that split between how much comes out and how much stays in, right? That for me is the simplest way to think of business. So it doesn't matter what type of business it is, and in many instances, organization, it will follow some kind of logic, this, right? So if that's the case, every single organization then, therefore, we can say fundamentally exists to create incremental value. And that's the key word here, whether it's public, whether it's private, whatever it is, it has to create incremental value, because if the value it creates is not incremental, it fundamentally will cease to exist. So we talk about resource, right? We talk about people, we talk about money, we talk about assets, right? Whatever it is, right? That kind of initial configuration of money, assets, time as well, right? Time, people, assets, money, whatever it is, that kind of configuration of each of these things is in essence the kind of driver for, or rather I should say resource management is the essence of the input. So let's talk about it as resource management. And then resource management, its calibration and its kind of configuration creates that incremental value. But incremental value has to be aligned with certain expectations, right? Because in many instances, incremental value has to be within certain confines, right? Because if it's too low or too high, if it's too low, then it's an opportunity cost, right? If you're creating, then it's an opportunity cost. And if it's too high, it's too good to be true. So in many instances, if you take a step back and you think about the decision-making process, right? Yes, it's about configuration of all of these things here, right? It's a massive configuration thing here. This incremental value that we're talking about has to fit within certain type of parameters, right? So the question I have for you guys, bros, is how do you define these parameters, right? How do you define these parameters? Like, how would you go about thinking whether it's an opportunity cost or if it's too good to be true? Like, what would your natural instinct tell you in doing so, bros? Anyone want to jump in here? Like, how would you define whether what you're doing is good or bad or too good to be true or not enough in light of the input? What do you guys think? Any thoughts there? I like to think of it like, you know, like a benchmark would help you unlock that, right? Some historical performance will help you assess that. Some kind of market or economic conditions, right, could help you assess that, right? So whatever it is that you're trying to do, whether it's a pricing strategy change, whether it's introducing a new product or service, whether it's increasing the volume of production that you have, whatever it is, right? Whatever it is, that will fall in here. But the implications of that would always need to be monitored in the context of the decision itself. And for me, a good way of determining at a very simple level of whether or not you're making a good decision is some kind of benchmark, looking at historical performance, trying to predict the future based on that. And of course, market movements and conditions, etc. But generally speaking, if we were to kind of review this whole discussion, it would be almost by having some level of ear to the ground, right? The closer you are to the ground, the closer you are to your customer, consumers, whatever, the better chance you have of not screwing this up. Did someone raise a question or have something to say? Just jump in, bros, because I can't actually see.
It was me, Fahad. So in the context of an emerging market or an emerging trend, let's say with AI, where there isn't a defined benchmark or historical performance, what do you do then? Do you simply default down to market conditions?
I think if you're looking at something like AI is a weird one, right? Because if we look at the kind of evolution of technology and so on, right? Normally the way technology comes into our lives is usually in waves, right? It comes like that. So one wave, followed by another wave, followed by a third wave, fifth wave, 10th wave, right? So that's normally what happens. So we are now at the age of AI. We don't know what's coming next, right? And prior to AI, and I'm making this stuff up, but it's probably blockchain that no one gave a shit about, right? In real terms, right? I think the issue with AI is no one knows. Are we at the beginning of the wave, or are we in the middle of the wave, or are we at the top of the wave? And the issue that people are having in terms of adopting AI is because it's advancing and evolving so quickly. People don't know where to get off. Like when you're on the train, you don't know what stop to get off at. I think that's what people are doing with AI now. And that's because there is no benchmark, there is no historical performance, and there isn't any real companies. Everyone knows they have to adjust for it, but they just don't know when they have to adjust for it. Now, who knows when, and everyone now talking about agentic AI. I don't even know what that means, but I just know it's better than what we have today. And that's a scary thought. Because if it's better than what we have today, then we are truly screwed as consultants, right? So for me, inherently, bros, the AI paradigm doesn't necessarily fit your traditional ways of thinking unless you look at it at a more granular level, right? So because AI is a big thing. In the consulting industry, for example, I don't care what anyone says. People should, I'm going to be sounding a bit dramatic here, but people should be getting fired right now. Like lots of people should be getting fired right now, but I think there is a keeping a brave face on it for the time being. But I do suspect there will be a bit of a bloodbath, because irrespective of where we are in this journey in the consulting industry, as I said, a huge amount of work that's being done by these junior people is, this kind of part of your career, this part of your career is under major threat. But then again, so is this, right? And I would say the leadership part is probably always going to be that people are always going to want to deal with senior executives at a people level. But there is a huge threat in that kind of foundations versus expertise phase. But and then of course some industries are more susceptible to AI disruption than others. I think consulting is probably one of those which is massively susceptible to consulting, whereas maybe not necessarily manufacturing. AI and automation, this idea that AI is going to go through your data and find stuff that you've completely lost, kind of missed over the last 10 years. And by changing these things using AI, it's going to create a huge amount of value. I think a lot of that is theoretical rather than practical. But industries like professional services, not just consulting, lawyers, maybe to an extent engineering and stuff like that, there's no way you can stay the same. So I think that this approach explains to me why AI hasn't been adopted, but it also explains that the paradigms by which we look at businesses today will not make sense in light of AI, because there is no history, there is no benchmark, and of course the market conditions keep on evolving. I don't know if that answers your question, bro, or just gives you 10 more questions, but that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, it's actually giving me 10 more questions, because I was going to ask next, where does the theme of data quality and actually validating the outputs of AI come into it? Or actually recognizing we don't know what we don't know. So what next?
I think we can answer the question of AI in a bit more detail, right? In the sense that AI for me it helps, in at least in our industry as consultants, it helps in 2 ways. There is the speed of which we do things, and then there is the depth, right? Now I think, like if you look, for example, at the Deloitte example, they overused AI and then they got caught out in a bad situation, right? So they went higher when it comes to depth, but they also went for speed. And as a result of which, they got caught up in a pretty bad place. So I think there will always be an adjustment period required for understanding how AI is going to take over. But I think, again, this is a case of going too fast on this thing, and then there's probably a level of human laziness as well, right? So unfortunately, bro, I don't think there really is an answer to that particular question right now. I think there is an opinion to that question, but I don't know if there's a genuine answer to that question right now. That's
so
how
Farhad,
yo, bro,
can I just try and answer that question for this bro, right?
Yeah.
So we do market research for clients, and one of the biggest challenges we have in the region is data, right? Because there either isn't any, or it's like an IP basis, with certain corporations, industries. So when we looked at projects in Iraq, for example, you cannot get any data, right? It's very, very difficult. So if you have a developer come to you and say, hey, we want to build real estate, for example, residential real estate in Iraq, how many windows will we need, for example, right? Like, it's very difficult to answer that. So when we went out and we spoke to a number of different data research houses and partners with a few as well, what we found was just that a lot of this is done on essentially it's done on like an inference basis. Okay, so they'll go out there, they'll take a sample, and then they'll say, okay, we think it's going to be this much of this much, and it's done on that premise. And a lot of projects start quite small, so where there is no data, they have to go out there and essentially create the data, and then they kind of do it in a step-by-step formation. So this is typically the case here in the Middle East at the moment, with data or lack of data, or a lot of unstructured data exists, where everyone's trying to make sense of it.
Yeah.
So that's why the AI piece is quite confusing to use, because AI itself doesn't have the data, or again, it's too unstructured for data for AI to make sense of. So that's one of the ways that we're finding that actually works. This is quite an intuitive question from the bro, because this is one of the biggest challenges we've been having with clients who in turn have been having that challenge themselves. And it's something which is an ongoing effort amongst a number of different partnerships that are happening to try and become like the Western standard of data, right? Where everything is recorded, like National Office of Bureau of Statistics and all of that exists. It just doesn't really exist over here properly. And even if it does exist, it's usually there's some IP behind it, or it's hidden away, for political reasons or something. So this is one of the areas that we also find challenges, but it is done on a step-by-step basis, where they kind of start small, if you like, and then they move incrementally from there. And it's a bit of an iterative process to see that, okay, if we were to build, let's just say 100 square kilometers of this land over here, and then they would kind of use inferences from other areas, maybe from Europe or from or wherever they can get data, and it's kind of do it that way. So this is This is the way that we've kind of experienced it so far.
You see, I think I think it's a very good point here, right? But if we break down the process of making a decision, right? If we break down the process of making a decision, there is definitely a data element of it, and his data is almost inevitably is going to look at history, right? Data, if you look at the kind of subcomponents of data, it's history, and that history multiplied by some kind of market condition or something will then give you some kind of forecast, right? That's the essence. But if you then look at decision making, there will be another kind of it might be even to the power of, right, or something, right, or some kind of something. It would be to the power of your gut instinct, right? So even if the data shows something like given the example by Othman, which is around the number of windows needed, ultimately your gut instinct has to play a part in that, right? Like, okay, the data is telling us to do it, but data alone is not going to make you make a decision, right? Your gut instinct is, okay, the data is telling us that it's the right thing to do. It's going to tell us the right price that we need to make. Therefore, it's going to give us the right type of materials and stuff like that. But ultimately, even the data it's about the data that we extract fundamentally tells us about the probability of the decision being correct or not. So the probability might increase as a result, but ultimately there will have to always be some level of gut instinct, which is, listen, you know, and again, with data in AI, it is garbage in, garbage out. And most organizations make big decisions. You know, this, if we thought about it from a weighting perspective, I think data, I don't know, maybe in kind of more traditional industries, I think it would be 30% data, 70% gut. And I think as time goes on, that will probably start equalizing itself a bit more. And obviously some industries, you know, the net 50, and then some industries might be completely the opposite. It might just be, well, we don't even need, like manufacturing, for example, it might be, actually this is 10 and then this is 90, right? But again, look, I think it's a very complicated thing to think of, and I don't think anyone really has the answer right now, unless there is effectively, you know, in terms of decision making, you're trying to predict the future, and I don't think anyone can say that AI is able to do that. Maybe it's able to do that in some instances than others, but at the same time, I don't know. Maybe there is a use case out there, but I'm unaware of a use case where AI has come. I just think, you know, again, if we look at depth versus speed, I don't think there's a reason why it's depth versus speed and not depth, speed, and accuracy. Because I think the accuracy piece is effectively your gut instinct, if that makes sense. But I could be wrong, man. Look, these are just my opinions, right? I'm not sure, bro. Asaka, that's probably made you think of 50,000 more questions, but it's a very interesting conversation.
No, but it makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah. Alhamdulillah. All right, let's keep it moving, bros. Now, 4 types of value creation, man. Like, and I like to think of this all the time, right? Which is, whenever I'm trying to make decisions or I'm trying to help people, and they, you know, I've been invited to discuss a particular issue, right? Whether it's public or private, it tends to be one of these 4 key things, right? So these are almost for me the kind of value creation parameters, right? And as good consultants, as good advisors, we're trying to figure out what's the priority for someone. And I always say this, the language of decision makers for me is fundamentally a language not necessarily translated in words, because people use different words in business for different things. And what you have to do is to be a good advisor or a good consultant, right, is understand what their priorities are. So these for me are not necessarily used consistently in terms of terminology, but they are used consistently in terms of priorities. So the priority usually for a private for-profit business is, of course, you know, number 1, strategic. The kind of value creation they're looking for, is financial. They are for profit and henceforth are trying to create profit. But at the same time, in order to create that profit, they will have to have a very clear agenda on being strategic. So they'll have a strategic value creation mandate. And of course, they would have to ensure that happens through some level of operational. Now, private for-profit companies will always scream no, of course, we're trying to help the economy, we're trying to do this, yada, 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 but it's a dotted line at best, right? They couldn't really care less. As long as the profits are coming in, shareholders are happy, we're good to go. And the reason I like to break this down is because a lot of people misunderstand non-profit businesses. Non-profit businesses also have to create value. They have to create profits, right? Now, so they will always be financial. It's just that they reinvest their profits rather than give their profits to shareholders, right? They have to be strategic in nature. They have to be operational. And again, they will potentially have some level of economic mandate, maybe a slightly darker or more dotted line compared to for-profits in terms of economic impact, etc. You know, they could start businesses which help certain industries and certain underrepresented groups and stuff like that. So there is a larger mandate there for economic rationale. But the public sector, and this is an interesting one, the public sector, in theory, has the darkest line. Oh, so let's use a different color here. It has the darkest line in terms of value creation compared to economic. Has to be very strategic, has to be operational, and probably has a dotted line now, right, towards financial, because it's not that the public sector has to become profitable, but what the public sector is trying to do is become sustainable, right? So I see that there is definitely a merging of, not really a merging, I would say there's more of an emphasis, at least than there was historically, about the public sector becoming more sustainable. And sustainability in the public sector is no longer about cutting costs. It's a function of, can we make money to offset some of our costs? So we're seeing a lot of these, you know, PPPs taking place in Saudi Arabia, which are not necessarily your traditional PPPs, right? And as part of, sorry guys, just one moment. Yeah, sorry, a lot of the PPPs that we're talking about in Saudi Arabia are not necessarily your traditional PPPs whereby you're building infrastructure. They are literally just handing over certain services that are delivered by the public sector traditionally to private sector companies in some kind of, you know, almost kind of micro concession basis, right? And it's basically the government will still provide the service for free, but if you want a more expedited or more technology-based solution, you can use the alternative as well. So, and again, this isn't about making the government profitable, it's about making the government more sustainable, because ultimately the role of government is what? To service its people. But anyway, the idea is that it doesn't matter what type of organization we're talking about, it must create value, and it's usually value across these 4 key parameters. So if we continue with this logic and we continue with this thinking, I'd like to think, for me, that this process that you can see in front of you right now is the ultimate kind of value configuration process, right? Every single organization has to go through this. So even that stuff we were talking about, fiberglass as an alternative to steel, it has to make sense. And this for me is, you know, I don't like talking about frameworks too much, but inherently, if you're going through any kind of major decision-making process, this for me is a process which is almost impossible to fail in terms of getting an answer, which an 8 out of 10, right? Because the reality is the decision-making process, if the inputs are bad, the outputs will be bad. So how do you minimize the probability of getting it completely wrong? Is by following a structured process. So this for me is my personal structured process, which ensures that I'm not going to have a complete disaster of a solution being discussed, right? So to that end, I like to always start off with garbage in, right? Well, not with garbage in, sorry. I like to think about the inputs, and the idea is that the inputs should avoid garbage in. So to minimize garbage in, right, inherently what I'm looking for from an internal perspective is, like we said, financial analysis, an operational capability statement, right? Maybe some kind of stakeholder, direction from the stakeholders. What we could look at from an external perspective could be some kind of market analysis, right? Some kind of supply and demand, right? These will be the inputs that we are looking for in order for us to therefore then make decisions going forward. Is there anything else that you guys can think of, external could be benchmarking, anything else that you could think of that will fit this initial internal assessment that you need to do to create, those kind of, to avoid garbage in. How do you mitigate that, right? Obviously, and I think you could ask ChatGPT here, right? 100%. But we've got a financial assessment, an operational assessment, maybe some kind of strategic assessment, external assessment. I mean, you could think about regulatory assessment, in terms of where we are today. And I think that's an important way of looking at it. This for me is where are we today, right? So if we consider that, is anything else you guys can think of that we could do from an internal perspective, external perspective, stakeholder engagement perspective, to understand where we are today? Is there anything that you guys think I may have missed? Anything at all? I don't think so, to be honest, but maybe I did, if anyone can think of anything.
That covers everything.
Alhamdulillah. So if we're going through this process of configuring for value, so this is the process of value. Sorry. This for me is the process of configuring for value. So if we do our internal assessment, if we do our external assessment, if we do our stakeholder engagement assessment, right? Oh, sorry, we could talk to stakeholders, shareholders, right? We could talk to the general public, whatever, right? This will allow us to create what I call some design principles. So the net outcome of this whole process of 1, 2, and 3, this will create our design principles. And then our design principles will fundamentally allow us to then start configuring our Rubik's Cube. And that a decision for me is, the best analogy for a decision for me is fundamentally the Rubik's Cube. The Rubik's Cube for me, like, really does, I just think it's the best kind of representation of decision making, because decision making is complicated, right? So what are we trying to do with the Rubik's Cube? We are trying to ultimately get to a point where each side of our Rubik's Cube is the respective color it needs to be. And once we've perfected the Rubik's Cube to the extent possible, we're in a position to then make a decision, right? So that's why I like the Rubik's Cube. And for me, we're going to discuss the Rubik's Cube on the following slide a little bit better. But the reason I like the analogy of the Rubik's Cube is because inherently, sometimes in a Rubik's Cube, you've got to take a step back to take a step forward. So slow progress means, well, long, I don't know, I can't remember the guy I was with last week, mashallah. He kept on saying this thing, and I was like, damn, that makes so much sense. I need to say that in my next TikTok session, but I didn't. But anyway, the point is that with, a Rubik's Cube has 6 sides, and each side has a very important, each side represents a priority, which is the colors in the context of your Rubik's Cube. But the idea is that sometimes you have to make a sacrifice in order to make progress. And I genuinely think the Rubik's Cube, for someone who's never solved a Rubik's Cube, I just think it's the most perfect analogy, right? If you are one of those dudes who can solve a Rubik's Cube in 10 seconds, then this doesn't apply to you because you've already cracked the Rubik's Cube. But ultimately, if we have a very clear understanding of our inputs, we understand how to configure value, the output of any configuration for creating value should be focused, should give us the choices available, should create some kind of advantage, and needs to be aligned throughout the organization. So this process of configuration for me is something, again, it has to return in some kind of structured outcome, right? So we have a structured input process, we have a structured configuration process, and we have a kind of almost like a checklist. Does this actually make sense? And what I want to do for the next like half an hour or so is really deep dive on this, right? On this configuration piece, because I think this part is straightforward, this part is straightforward, this part is straightforward. Yes, in terms of outputs, what we want is something which is focused on, gives us choices, gives us finds where the advantage is, and of course drives alignment. But it's this process which is where most people get stuck. For me, the input and the output are quite fixed, but it's the configuration piece which is where our brains kind of either succeed or fail. So that's where I want to emphasize. So building upon this kind of value chain, this value configuration process using the Rubik's Cube, for me at least, I've identified 6 key kind of factors which I think genuinely help, right? So for me, the Rubik's Cube that I've designed and I've shown you guys, for me, is 6 key elements, right? So each of these 6 things will be a different face or different side of the Rubik's Cube, right? And we're going to go through this because I genuinely, for me, if we get a good understanding of this, everything else just becomes easier. Everything else becomes a mechanism of helping and understanding. So for me, step 1, and I'll just do this like this. So we have initially internal, right? We have an internal review of our business today. That for me is the kind of step 1 part of it, which is a detailed internal review. That means the strategy, that means the business model, that means the operating model. The second element for me is the external lens, right? And think of these as levers or lens, whatever, right? That's just consulting wishy-washy terminology. But there's an internal review, there's an external review. There is implications from a timing perspective, an implication from the value chain of our business and the value chain that we're supporting. There is, of course, a financial component. And there is one thing which is usually in many instances in many businesses, which is overlooked, which is the speed of decision making, right? So many organizations they suffer not from the intelligence to make good decisions. They suffer from the inability to make good, fast decisions, right? So again, I want to go through each one of these in a bit more detail to give us some context as to what these mean. Bro, jump in, man. You don't need to raise your hand.
The design principles, right? How do they impact the configuration levers?
So the design principles, for example, right? So if we say we've done our assessment that we don't have any money to invest, right? Just say for here, right? Financially, we're broke. We don't have any money to invest. From an investment analysis perspective, we can't therefore then assume that we have $100 million to invest in all these new initiatives. Does that make sense, bro? So there has to be a link from the design principles into the configuration of each of these.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah, and then it works across every single element here, right? So if we do an external assessment, people don't want the product we're selling now. For example, Pizza Hut closed down all of their restaurants in the UK, 60-something restaurants in the UK, right? The reality is that we can't then say we're going to double our sales by increasing the number of restaurants we have, right? So then that would make us incompatible with what the market is telling us, right? So the idea is that your design principles will fundamentally be the kind of red lines that you have to put for this configuration to continue going forward.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah. No worries, bro. And feel free to jump in, bro. This isn't just me talking. This is engagement between us all, right? So don't raise your hands and stuff. We're good. But thank you for being considerate. So
no worries.
What I want to do, right? Be like Usman, who just jumps in whenever he wants. I'm just kidding, bro. You know I love you, bro. Let's talk about configuration number 1, right? Which is the internal configuration. Right? So the internal configuration for me is about having the right strategy, which is aligned with your business model, which is therefore aligned with your operating model. Right? This is, for me, the essence of internal, because you can discuss this stuff internally until the cows come home, but the reality is that this is still an internal exercise. And the internal exercise is usually defined around the process of getting from point A to, say, a point B, right? The process of designing an internal strategy, business model, and operating model is a case of getting from point A to point B. In order for us to get from point A to point B, we have to define some kind of target, right? What is the definition of the end point per se? That's a critical component of this. So we have to define that, right? But also in terms of defining to get from point A to point B, we also need to be considerate of that getting from point A to point B will require a route, right? So there's going to be a route here. Right? So there's going to be multiple options for the route that we need to take. There's going to be opportunities to cut the timing down of that particular route. But we also need to determine, so there's the definition, there's the route, and of course then there is the the actual vehicle that's going to take us there. So are we going by car? Are we going by boat? Are we going by bicycle? And so on and so forth. So the internal alignment of strategy, business model, and operating model has to get us from point A to point B, but we need to define what the end point is, the destination. We need to define the route, and we need to define the mechanism. So I like to think of strategy in that context, or rather this internal configuration. Now, this is where business and consulting gets really annoying, right? This process, right, sometimes it's called a target operating model. Sometimes it's called a strategy definition process, right? Sometimes it's just called the business plan, right? But that's exactly the point here. In many instances, the naming convention, unfortunately, is just different from place to place, to person to person. And the thing about being a good consultant is being able to kind of define the difference between what they're wanting, which is sometimes the words coming out of their mouth, versus what they need. So listening to and reading between the lines is a part of consulting, which is genuinely very difficult, but you get better at it with time. And not only do you get better at it with time, you're able to then kind of move your client to start using the same terminologies as yourself. It's a very, very important skill set, but generally speaking, people get this part wrong massively, right? And it's not because they don't understand it, they're just using the wrong terminologies, because it ain't rocket science, right? But for me, strategy is a function of designing a vision statement, right? Mission statement, it's some objectives, it's some initiatives. The business model is about your product, your price, your place, your promotion, and then wrapping it with some kind of, payment mechanism, right? So is it a subscription? Is it a, pay per product type thing, right? And then your operating model is a function of your people, your processes, your tech, your governance, right? And the idea again is that internally, what you're doing consistently is you're trying your best to configure these things, right? Just like in your Rubik's Cube, right? So your Rubik's Cube isn't about every side is the same and we need to configure each side. There is a sub-configuration that needs to take place. So this is, for me, sub-configuration level 1. Probably the most important, because this sets the kind of, like I said, it defines where you're trying to go, right? And we're going to go into the details of the, what is the vision, what is the mission, what is objectives, initiatives, etc. And it's actually very important. If you want to understand how organizations move, it's very important. But I like to think of it as follows. And again, people use different ways of explaining this. I like to think of it as, this is the what we're doing. This is the why we're doing it, because this is about money. This is about direction, right? And this is the how. So going back to my kind of journey analogy, for me, this then becomes, this then therefore becomes the kind of driver as such, the direction, driver, whatever you want to say. This for me then becomes the engine. Are you going for a V8 bi-turbo? Are you going for a V12? Or are you going for an electric hybrid Toyota Prius? And this then becomes it. Are we going by a boat? Are we going by a motorcycle, or the chassis of the car, whatever you may have, right? So it's this configuration that starts off this process, and I think it's just a good way of looking at it. But this is literally step 1. But I want to deep dive into this, because in many instances, people talk about vision statements and missions, and the word objective is probably, after the word strategy, is probably the most misused word in business. But then, of course, there are initiatives, right? So I want to just talk about this briefly, just to get everyone comfortable with some of the things that you're going to be hearing when you're dealing with executives. Now, the idea is that a strategy statement or a strategy document, there is a level of direction setting, and then there is a level of execution. And I think, I don't know who said it, someone famous said it, which is basically strategy without execution is a waste of time or something like that, right? So bearing that in mind, this stuff is genuinely very important. But think of any business, right? A vision statement is a function of, we want to be number 1, or we want to be top 5, or we want to be, the leaders in something, right? It's usually something that sets an aspiration of where you want to be, right? That's a part of this. Okay. The mission statement is almost then the how are we going to become that. So if we want to be number 1, the mission statement is then how. we are going to become the number one by providing the best possible service, the best possible customer experience, and the best product at the best possible price. That's the how of your whatever your aspiration may be. But then where it gets interesting is this kind of translation into action, right? So then we go into execution. So if you want to become number one, if you want to do that by providing the best possible product, the best possible service, and so on and so forth, then for me, it becomes a function of you have to set yourself some objectives. Objective is almost like the quantification of your mission statement across multiple parameters. So they could be a strategic objective, which is, for example, market share. They could be a financial, which could be a revenue or a profit, right? There could be operational objectives, which could be again linked to wastage and so on. And then there is probably some kind of maybe even regulatory. We want to be compliant, right? Or economic for that matter as well, if you're talking about government in many instances, right? Economic could be GDP impact, for example, right? So again, the idea is that we start off with some level of aspiration. We then create a mission statement around that aspiration, which is the how. And sometimes people put mission before vision and so on. It's again, this is the kind of the pain of working in this world is that there's no real defined way of doing things. But the part of objectives and initiatives, this is something which is pretty well understood. So you've got your quantification of your economic GDP, I don't know, create 1 million jobs, for example, right? Your strategic market share increased by, by 10%, for example. Your financial revenues and profits increased by 20%, for example. You see how you can very easily translate aspiration into a how into some objectives and quantify them. And then the part of this which then becomes, even more deeper into execution is that each one of these initiatives will therefore, or rather each one of these objectives will have multiple initiatives. And the reason you create multiple initiatives, the best way to think about them is like mini projects. And the idea is that each of these mini projects will therefore allow accountability, will allow, so you could say this person is responsible for this initiative. Then you can say there's an allocation of budget, you can allocate some time, whatever it is, resource, whatever it is. And then what it allows you to do, and this is when strategy actually works, right? Is then what it allows you to do is you're effectively cascading down. That's the point. And then you are monitoring coming back up. So that's the process of defining and making strategy work. That's how strategy works, right? And again, it's a huge, so if your vision and mission is devoid of reality, guess what will happen here? Nothing, right? So again, configuring your strategy is very important, and it's like a sub configuration of your Rubik's Cube. It's like one of the 9 squares. But then you have to do the same with your business model. So what is the product you're selling? So you need to have a business model configuration. What is the pricing point? What is the place? Are we selling online? Are we selling physically? And then, of course, what is your marketing strategies, right? So if you think of it from this perspective, this needs to be empowered by your product, your price, your place, whether it's e-commerce or whether it's, I don't know, some kind of trucks, whatever, right? And then, of course, that needs to then also be looked at from the perspective of your people. Do we have the right number of people? Do we have the right people? Do they have the expertise? This is supposed to be like a degree hat, right? Whatever they're called. So do we have the right number of people? Do we have the right quality of people? And are the people organized in the right way? So there's so many variables in this process, right? That we need to be considerate of all of that. And this stuff, again, as I said, businesses are processes on processes on processes. So the idea that somehow businesses, sorry guys, keep on jumping, maybe you don't need this process. Maybe AI can remove this particular process. Maybe certain processes are slowing you down, but maybe some processes are not in place there to protect you, right? So maybe we need more processes. And of course, AI, your CRMs, your ERPs, right? All of these things come into this stuff, right? Of course, and then you have to have the right governance structure, of course, again, to protect the business, right? You need to protect your business. You need to ensure that decisions are being made fast, etc., etc. Right? So again, there's a lot of configuration that goes into just one of these lenses, but it's a good way of kind of understanding. So again, let's go back to our Rubik's Cube. So we're literally just talking about one side, one of the 6 sides there, but there's a huge amount of configuration that takes place there. And that configuration has to be documented as part of this particular process, right? And it has to be done across all of these elements, right? So this part of it, I call the B12. This is the Boost 12 something framework. I've forgotten what it is. But it's just, for me, is an easy way of doing it. Now, the second side of your Rubik's Cube is then this idea that you don't work as a business in isolation. It's not as simple as supply and demand. Business is always much more complicated than supply and demand. So as a function of this supply and demand, you also need to be considerate of, are you keeping your regulators happy, right? What are the regulators offering to the people, the actual users of your service, right? And of course, you need to be considerate of competition, right? Again, super, super important stuff that we're talking about, that businesses have to be considerate of every single day. And naturally, as the world gets more and more integrated and transactions and businesses get bigger, who are the enablers of business? Anyone want to jump in here? Who are the enablers of business? Right? Banks, right? Being able to borrow money at a reasonable, oh shit, my battery's running low. Sorry. I forgot about that. Yeah. Banks, investors, you got to keep everyone happy, right? It's very important. Right? And then of course, that's the facilitation part of it. So again, there is this internal configuration of strategy, business model, operating model, but in isolation, that's useless. You need to think about it from an external lens as well, right? You need to look at it from a timing perspective. So one of the buzzwords that you're going to hear, it's not even a buzzword, it's genuinely there you go. Oh, man, you guys are firing off in the comments, man. I appreciate it. Yes, absolutely. Investors, D. Right? From a timing perspective, you've got to be very, very comfortable with these types of things, right? Because in Saudi Arabia, for example, the thing that people are always talking about is quick wins. And that is a timing thing. Does this make an impact in the short term? Now, people can argue that, long term, we need to think long term and stuff like that. But and in many instances, unfortunately, you just don't get the chance to do that. You have to show the public, you have to show, and this is not a Saudi thing, this is a global thing. People want to see results, right? So quick wins becomes very important, but at the same time, you need to be planning in the short term, the medium term, and the long term. And this is that immediate configuration, right, of your internal stuff and your external stuff. Very, very important stuff, right? So we're talking about this is our internal lens and our external lens, and these things have to be configured, and they are constantly being configured again and again and again, right? Of course, we need to think about our value chain. So from our value chain perspective, there is the non-core activity. So this is the porters, something. I'm not big on the whole using frameworks thing, but this one is a good one. It just helps you look at businesses in a very simple way. So is any decision we're making, does it have an impact on our core business? So core business would be, for example, inbound logistics, which would be raw materials. Operations would be like some kind of manufacturing processes, right? And then the outbound logistics would be then taking our product to our customers. We'd have a sales and marketing team who will drive sales. And then you'd have a post kind of customer servicing solution, etc. And that should result in some kind of creation of value. So this is a nice way of looking at that, that 1 + 1 = 3 thing. The porter's value chain helps you understand that. And then in many instances, the idea is that, listen, if we made a change here, would this make a change here without disrupting this? So it shows you about implications, right? Implications and outcomes. And now, if we made our human resources more effective, would it help us here? If we changed our technology, would it help us make this process more effective, more efficient? Maybe if we had a better procurement strategy, we could then, buy raw materials cheaper and at a more consistent rate, for example. All of this will then be looked at from the implications of your margin. It's just a good way of looking at it. So any decisions you make, will it have an impact on our value chain as a business, both the core and non-core. So this is another lens, and of course, financials, right? And you guys know now, right? I don't like to be that guy who goes into the details of everything. I want to be practical, right? And being practical when you're looking at financials means fundamentally looking at your P&L, because the P&L is where 80% of decisions are fundamentally made. P&L is where 80% of decisions are made. I'm telling you 100%. I don't care what anyone says. Because, and it's very simple, because the P&L can very easily be broken down into 3 levels. So there's level 1, there's level 2, and there is level 3. Okay? Now, level 1 is market. Right? So let's take, for example, your business's revenue. Let's just say, for argument's sake, that your business wants to 2x its revenue, right? So revenue equals number of units multiplied by price. So let's say you want to 2x your revenues. The reality is, in order for you to 2x your revenues, you have to either increase your units or increase your price. That's the only 2 variables that you have there, right? And it might be the case where if you then therefore increase your price, you might decrease in units. So it's very strategic. It's very linked to your market. And again, if you increase the units, it might decrease the price because you're increasing supply, right? This is about increasing supply. This is about, and what are you fundamentally testing here? You're testing the elasticity of your particular product or service, right? So this is effectively your insights into how the market operates. Very simple stuff. It's not rocket science. But of course, being able to say it with confidence is very, very important, right? So your first layer of battle or whatever it is happening at that particular level. Now, once you think you've configured this part correctly and you've got it aligned with the elasticity of your product or service in the market, right? Fundamentally, you have equal revenue. So revenue minus your COGS, or otherwise known as your direct costs, is what will give you your gross profit. Now, gross profit fundamentally gives you an insight into your product or service at a product or a unit economic level. And this is an extremely important insight for a business, which is unit economics, because unit economics allows you and gives you some kind of, or rather some real insight into the contribution of your actual product towards your costs, your expenses, right? So it's a very, very important thing, and it's something that businesses get wrong a lot, very, very badly, I should say. Can someone tell me what is a direct cost? Because again, the reason I do this, bros, is because a lot of people just kind of wash over this and they think they understand direct costs, but they don't, right? So I like to explain it in a very simple way. Does anyone want to jump in and tell me what a direct cost is? Anyone? Okay, I shall reveal, right? And this is the easiest way I can think of explaining this. A direct cost, right, or your cost of goods, is the cost which directly changes as a result of the number of units you're selling. So if you're selling 100 here, or you're selling 500 here, your cost of goods or your direct costs will change in complete alignment, right? So if you're selling 100, your cost of goods will be for 100 units. If you're selling 500, your direct costs are directly attributable to the number of units that you are fundamentally selling. Is that cool, guys? And the idea is that your gross profit will therefore have a margin which contributes, right, towards your expenses. So your expenses are expenses which are not, right? So these are expenses which are not, so they are not directly attributable to the number of units. So can someone give me an example of what that might be? So if you're not, then I shall, right? So it could be, for example, your office space, right? It could be for your water and utilities, right? It could be, for example, your admin staff, right? It doesn't matter how many units you sell, you know, it's going to be that. Now, in the case of Pepsi, and I just like to give this example because it helps it hit home. In the case of Pepsi, your direct costs would be costs which are directly attributable to the volume of cans you're selling. So in the case of Pepsi, that would be sugar, water, aluminium or aluminum for our American friends. And it's the word is aluminium. And of course, the crazy amount of chemicals they put in that sucker, right? These are all direct costs. These are directly attributable. Will go up and go down according to how many cans you're selling, right? So overhead cost, Fozia, is your expenses. Regulatory costs would be expenses, although I'm not too sure how you would account for that, but anyway. Making sense, guys? Rent, yes, rent again here. So understanding this, I promise you guys, is 80% of where decisions take place, right? Operational decisions, usually pricing decisions, everything, whatever it is, pricing, you know, understanding strategic impact and so on. And this is what it would look like fundamentally as at the essence of what we're talking about. The essence of this is that whenever you're talking about revenues and costs, right? When you're talking about forecasting, you're talking about the past, you're talking about the present, and you're talking about the future. So understanding your P&L is very important. Why? Because it allows you to do this. Okay, well, historically, we were doing pretty good. Oh shit, something bad happened, right? And we need to fix it. And now we need to think of what the options are from pricing, from product, from, you know, from our strategy, whatever it is, to think of what the options are going forward, right? And then, of course, you need to be considerate of, well, actually, historically, we were doing great. We had our fixed costs, right? So these are our fixed costs. And then we had our variable costs. But then, of course, our variable costs start decreasing because of our variable costs. And now we need to think what will happen to our variable costs in the future, right? Does that make sense, guys, how this is fixed? Because these are not related to the amount of sales. But historically, we were making a profit. Now we're just barely breaking even. And now we need to fix this going forward. This is fundamentally the whole idea of forecasting. And this is where strategy plays out. Now, there is obviously other financial statements. There's your balance sheet, and there is, of course, your cash flow statement. But generally speaking, 80% of the conversation tends to be focused around this whole debate around here, right? So again, there's the forecasting element, but there is also there are three types of financial things that you need to be comfortable with, right? When you're doing these 6 lenses. And I appreciate it's 6 lenses, but there are multiple mini lenses within that, right? So we've already discussed financial, right? So the financial stuff is your P&L, balance sheet, and of course your cash flow statement. But from an investment perspective, right, it's whether or not the investment even makes sense or not. So if you're going to make an investment, it's how much money is coming out, what is the OPEX of that money, and then of course what is the revenues or upside, right, associated, and does this make sense from an NPV perspective? Does this make sense from an IRR perspective? Does this make sense from a WACC perspective, and so on and so forth, right? And then from an economic perspective, it's from a GDP impact perspective. Now, a lot of people talk about GDP and they have no idea what they're talking about, right? The easiest way, and I'm not saying I'm an economist, but the easiest way of thinking about GDP is the amount of additional profit you're creating. And I know economists are going to be mad at me, right? But I don't care. This is about being practical. It's about the amount of additional profit being circulated into the economy. Plus, oh, Sultan, come here, boy. My boy, Sultan. What's wrong, my boy? You okay? Okay, you stay with Bob, okay? You hungry, boy? Okay. You lie down and Bob will look after you, okay? So GDP impact is a function of additional profit and additional jobs. And then you use some kind of multiplier effect to see what the long-term impact of that is. That's it. That's it. And we're going to go into each of these in much more detail. But again, I just wanted to get some of these concepts out there, right? And like I said, the last element, the last Thank you, bro. The last element is the speed of making decisions, because in many instances, organizations struggle with making decisions, not because they don't have the capability of doing them, is the organization is just not structured well enough to make decisions fast, getting people on board, getting people aligned. And a lot of that is to do with governance. A lot of that is to do with, lots of different things. But inherently, the key point from a speed perspective is when you're making decisions in the world in which we work, a good decision, a good plus fast decision is better than a perfect. You want to go play? Plus slow decision. And that's the important part of decision making, right? A good fast decision is better than a perfect slow decision. So sometimes your decisions will not look perfect like this Rubik's Cube. Sometimes your decisions will look like this. Sometimes your decisions will ultimately look like this, right? Where your Rubik's Cube is not perfect, but you have enough comfort and you have enough evidence to say, you know what, it's worth taking the risk, right? So in many instances, this is what happens to organizations. They're making decisions with not 100% clarity, but the decision maker he's down to take the risk as such, right? So again, but it's the idea of making a good decision fast rather than a perfect decision slow, because this will basically mean you are uncompetitive. So what we've done so far and today is we've looked at those 6 lenses, right? Those 6 lenses, right? Let's just do a quick recap of the 6 lenses so that we're all on the same page here. So we looked at the internal configuration. Okay, go in this one here. Sorry, guys. This is. I'm coming. Sorry, guys. I've got to just take care of this. I'll be one. Otherwise, Sultan is going to cause me major amounts of distress. Come on, let's go. Let's go this in your bathroom. Oh, my baby. I want Okay, you play, Baba's gonna work with it.
Hey, Mama.
Yeah, excuse me, Baba's working now.
This is for Sophie's.
Yeah, she did a good. No, it's your name. You win the certificate.
Oh no. I don't know what to do that.
All right, guys, I'm back. So just recapping on those 6 levers or lenses, whatever you want to call it. So we've done internal, we've done external, we've done time, we've done value chain, we've done financial, and of course, the speed of decision making, the ability to actually go ahead and do this. Yeah, I had to make a quick decision with Sultan going to the toilet there. Otherwise, the long-term implications of cleaning up, yeah, that would have been horrible. Anyway, so the idea is then, if we look at problem solving from these 6 decisions, from these 6 lenses, what we'll end up with is some level of, we'll need to measure the impact of all of this, right? So again, going back to the Rubik's Cube analogy, the closer we are to having it done properly, right? So the closer we are to having this, the better, I guess, we would have mechanisms of measuring the value that we've created. So that value creation mechanics would be, for example, from a strategic perspective, would be what? It would be, market share, for example. That's a good strategic indicator of what we're doing. Makes sense. Financial could be revenue, profit, cash flow, whatever it is, right? So these would be your traditional things. And operational could be about minimizing wastage and so on and so forth. But we've covered a lot in, the best part of 2 hours. But again, the idea is that if we are constantly Sultan, baby, you mind? Thank you. Right. So if we talk about the implications of what we're saying from a strategic, financial, operational perspective, this is how we will measure value. And that's fundamentally going to be captured in something like a business model canvas. Now, again, like I said, all KPIs, exactly, right? Fundamentally, I don't like using frameworks, but a business model canvas is a good way of reflecting all those 6 lenses that configure. So it's easy to draw a business model canvas, but populating it without the requisite inputs needed, it doesn't work, right? It doesn't work. You have to think about this in a more strategic way. So the business model canvas for me is a good way of representing everything, that configuration. So a lot of the time people talk about kind of frameworks like the business model canvas, operating model canvas, strategy canvas, etc. But those canvases fundamentally don't let you go through the process of configuration. This process of configuration is the value. It's not the outcome. It's not the documentation in a framework. So when people tell me about, KPIs, they keep talking about framework. For me, guys, the framework is neither here nor there. You can populate this with whatever jargon and garbage you want, but it's the actual Rubik's Cube configuration, which is the important stuff, the value creation and the thinking around the value creation that makes most sense. So actually, here's a good way of looking at it now. Right? So the way you configure this whole thing and the way this whole thing comes together is you have your leaders at the top of an organization, you have your managers who are the doers, and then you have your common workers, right? The idea is that the leaders will design the vision, or rather, let's say the leaders will fundamentally design the Rubik's Cube for an organization, right? That has to be cascaded down into objectives and initiatives. And then the objectives and initiatives are further cascaded down to individuals in your organization. And then the idea is that any organization that is effective in terms of meeting its strategy will have to start. So we've got one side of it, which is cascading down. We've got one side of it, which is cascading up. And then what you have is build a loop system, and this will be effectively you monitoring your KPIs, etc., etc. And then this is you constantly monitoring whether or not your configuration is working or not. Right. So this is how the process of implementing strategy and monitoring it actually works. So again, I know it's a lot to take on board, but like I said, I'm not in the new iterations of the Boost Analyst program. We're not doing basic stuff anymore. We're doing super intense leadership style stuff, right? This is the stuff that will, if you understand these processes, you will have conversations with CEOs very, very comfortably. So the case study is, again, we're going to start talking about alternative to steel, glass fiber, polymer reinforcement rebar. So inshallah, over the next couple of weeks, inshallah, that's what we're going to be talking about. These are real problems faced by real countries, faced by the world over. So, and I appreciate I went off on a very, very detailed one. So guys, if you have questions, you want to jump in and you want to chime in on anything, let me know, inshallah, man. I'm happy to answer questions or, yeah, it's been a bit quiet. I've been talking nonstop for like an hour and 10 minutes now. So yeah, please let me know. Hit me up, man. Don't send messages in the group because I can't see them. Say something.
Awesome, thank you, man.
I appreciate you, bro. Jazakallah khair, bro. We need to have a discussion about cars at some point, bro.
Happily.
Inshallah.
Inshallah.
All right, bro. Anyone else? Any questions? Anyone have any thoughts? Anyone clarifications? Like the whole idea here, bro, is listen. Very few people teach this stuff. And very few people will actually answer your questions around this. So I'm happy to do that if anyone. But it does take time. You're not going to learn this stuff once and khalas, you're an expert now. It does take time. But remember Rubik's Cubes, man. This is the most important thing.
Yeah, Fahad, can I just get your take on the balance sheet and the cash flow statement, which obviously supplements the P&L when it comes to decision making as well?
Yeah. I mean, look, ultimately, I like to think of it like this, right? 'Cause, I mean, look, ultimately, I like to think of it like this, right? 'Cause, I mean, look, ultimately, I like to think of it like this, right? 'Cause, I mean, look, ultimately, I like to think of it like this, right? 'Cause, I mean, look, ultimately, I like to think of it like this, right? 'Cause, I mean, look, ultimately, I like to think of it like this, right? 'Cause, I mean, look, ultimately, I like to think of it like this, right? 'Cause, I mean, look, ultimately, I like to think of it like this, right? 'Cause, I mean, look, ultimately, I like to think of it like this, right? 'Cause, I mean, look, ultimately, I like to think of it like this, right? 'Cause, I mean, look, ultimately, I like to think of it like this, right? 'Cause, I mean, look, ultimately, I like to think of it like this, right? 'Cause, I mean, look, ultimately, I like to think of it like this, right? 'C is a very good it's a very good question, right? So the way I like to explain cash flow, because remember, profit and revenue are accounting treatments. They're not they don't reflect the reality as such, right? So what you would have normally in a business is the accounting will say you're doing well, you're making lots of sales, right? And then your costs will be as a function of fact, because you have to pay those on a monthly basis. So the difference between your revenue and your cost equals profit. Many businesses fail irrespective of how much profit, because profit is an accounting treatment. Right? Businesses fail. Why? Because ultimately their cash flow profile is very different to their revenue and cost profile. So, and again, this is one of the things that we have to deal with a lot, is that we don't get any cash flow from our customers, and then they'll give us a huge amount of cash flow, and then they'll give us a huge amount of cash flow. So your cash flow profile is actually a cash position, whereas your profit and your cost is a cash position. So cost is cash, right? In many instances, profit is accounting. So if you compare your cost your cash positions, your cash in and your cash out, the timing of this is a major pain in the ass, especially for businesses like ours. So henceforth, it is a massive pain in the butt. So even if your business is profitable from an accounting perspective, it can be a massive pain in the butt. And at the same time, from a balance sheet perspective, what you're normally looking for from a balance sheet perspective is whether or not you're utilizing your assets well enough, or maybe you have too much debt on your balance sheet and therefore it's restraining you from doing stuff. So generally speaking, you don't need to go into the balance sheet and the cash flow at a strategy level unless there is a strategic cleaning up of a balance sheet, or there's a strategic rationale for why the cash flow is kind of important. In many in the vast majority of strategy projects, you'll normally be looking at the kind of accounting level stuff, which is normally around the P&L. But if you're talking about big investment projects and stuff like that, you would always be considerate on the impact on not only your profit and loss, but your P&L, your cash flow statement, and of course your balance sheet. Otherwise, I think the way to look at it is that from a comprehensive perspective, right? If you're looking at it in terms of in-depth, P&L, like I said, is a lot of it is accounting based. But moving from just purely academic work into kind of more reality based work, you have to look at your cash flow statement and of course your balance sheet, because when banks fund, they don't just fund, for example, looking at your P&L, they'll be looking at your balance sheet, and they'll be definitely be looking at your cash flow statement, whether or not you can service whatever debts you're taking out. So it's very important stuff. I'm not an expert in it, but I do know what's important and what's not. So again, that's how I like to teach, based on the basis of practicality. So yeah, anyway, that's me. I hope that helps, bro. And I'm guessing, bro, even you have a consulting, you have the same issues that we do.
Yeah, really. The question is, how do you mitigate this, right? These big sort of cash lumps that you get, and then these sort of almost zero periods. How do you mitigate against that? So it's a liquidity concern, right? So we need to figure out how to do that.
Into working capital, though.
Say again?
Is it not going to your working capital? So your like days paid in, your days sales out.
Unfortunately, bro, you're kind of approaching this from the perspective that small businesses have the luxury of getting financing at today. For example, our payroll is about 400,000 dirhams a month, which is about $100,000, right? Every month. Baby, that's for contact lenses. You don't eat it. Okay. But the idea is, bro, is if I ask my bank to get me some kind of liquidity solution, bro, they've offered me, this is Emirates NBD, have offered me 300,000 max 300,000 dirham working capital facility at 10% interest. So it just doesn't even make remote sense, bro. So what I've done, just to answer Osman's question, right, is I've started creating new revenue streams, right, which is doing smaller projects, which is doing things like TikTok, which is doing things like selling products and services to offset that. And the idea is that slowly but surely, these products and services that I'm creating these TikTok accounts, etc., help offset that. So then when the big lump sums come in, you don't get to enjoy them because as soon as they come in, they go back out, right? And that's what I'm trying to avoid. I live my best life, man. So,
They're becoming your enablers.
say again?
So the small income streams that you're getting to offset, are they becoming your enablers then, rather than the bank?
Oh yeah, absolutely, man. Yeah, absolutely, man. Absolutely. And now, inshallah, you guys will be seeing this, and I'll be showing this to you guys first. I actually did a session on it last week. The guys and I have, alhamdulillah, built something like a technology solution, which we think is going to be massively, massively popular. And inshallah, we'll be announcing it very soon, man. So I'm going to be showing it to the Boost Analyst program, guys, very, very soon, inshallah.
Inshallah.
So yeah, that's me, man. Sultan, can you say hi, guys?
Hi guys.
Everyone,
Sultan.
say hi. Say hi, uncle.
Hi Uncle.
Oh
You
my
okay?
God, I'm an uncle.
Alhamdulillah. It's my boy. So that's me for today, bros. I know it was a lot to take on board, but look, that's why we record the sessions. Osman's going to be posting it in the session in the group very soon. Any issues, guys, let me know. And inshallah, maybe I'll try to do a session during the week just to recap. And then we'll, again, inshallah, next Saturday, we'll continue in more detail. Inshallah.
Inshallah. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.
Thanks a lot.
Okay, you bros.
Bye.
Jazakallah khair, man.
Assalamu.
Take care,
Thank
man.
you.
Have a good day.